Welcome to This Week in Hastings Headline History, where we take a look back at what was making news around Hastings and St. Johns County, Florida, over a century ago. These are stories directly out of the pages of the Hastings Herald, which was published weekly in the early 1900s. It's fascinating to hear what they were talking about and how they spoke in their articles from over 100 years ago. So sit back and enjoy as I share with you a few of the stories from this week in 1920. Are fake officers operating in county? Prohibition officers, real or fake, have been operating in the vicinity of Hastings during the week just past and are said to be still at work. From reports given of their activities, it seems the sheriff should get on the job concerning them and find out whether they are real or otherwise. The experience of one prominent man who was held up by the men on Wednesday night is probably typical of others. The man in question was proceeding towards St. Augustine about midnight, and at a point just this side of Deep Creek Bridge was forced to stop his car because of another car standing in the middle of the road. As he stopped, 3 men flourishing revolvers stepped up to the side of the car, showed badges, and declared themselves prohibition enforcement officers and proceeded to search his car. The car being found to contain no contraband, the men apologized for their search and asked the driver if he ever drank. Upon his reply that he had been known to do so, one of the 2 produced a full quart of Johnny Walker and invited him to have a drink. He reports further that upon his return to Hastings the following morning, he saw the same trio near Deep Creek Bridge, all far gone in the advanced stages of intoxication. Unconfirmed reports indicate the men have stopped other cars since Wednesday night, although the extent of their operations and the success of their searches is not known. But even the real officers were a cause for complaints this week back in 1920, as this week's paper has an editorial discussing the pushback against the enforcement of the Prohibition Amendment. The editorial is titled "The Real Cause," and it reads, "The editor of the Homestead Enterprise has got himself all harried up because some of the Florida newspapers have been spending some of their energy recently cussing out the manner in which the 18th Amendment is being enforced. Among other remarks on the subject, he cuts loose with the following: if any newspaper may say the 18th Amendment is no good, why not say it of each and all the others? Obedience to law is an obligation, not an option." So far as can be observed, no newspaper in Florida has advocated the disobedience of the 18th Amendment. It is a law, and that is the end of the matter. What the newspapers, or at least what those which have not adopted a fanatical view, contend, is that one amendment does not overshadow the entire Constitution to the extent of making void every other article and amendment in it, as would be judged from the methods employed by the officers engaged in enforcing prohibition. Equally important with the 18th Amendment is the 4th Amendment, which reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized." To all intents and purposes, that amendment has been wiped off the Constitution so far as prohibition officials are concerned. As matters stand today, no person is safe in his home effects or anything else from unreasonable and unjustified search. Prohibition officers without warrant or right search houses, property, and effects by force of might only. Any person riding along the road in an automobile is liable to be stopped in his car, searched at any moment, perhaps several times before he has completed his trip. Baggage shipped on trains is ruthlessly broken open and damaged, not because the searcher has any reason to believe it may contain liquor, but merely on the chance that it may, or in some cases, just as an excuse in order that the searcher may help himself to any article which may strike his fancy. No law, which in its enforcement is the continuous cause of injustice and hardship, is just a law, nor is it one which will stand alone unchallenged. The 18th Amendment in itself, being a law, must be accepted by the American people. The methods of its enforcement will not be accepted indefinitely. The people have rights under the Fourth Amendment superior to those of the Prohibition officers under the 18th. In other news, an auditorium was in sight for Hastings. The article reads, "Apparently there is now strong grounds for hope that in the immediate future Hastings will have its much-wanted and long-awaited auditorium and motion picture theater. The promoters of the proposition are the Brennan brothers, who have come to Hastings from Daytona. The two men proposed the erection of a theater building at the corner of Main and Latin Street and have made application for a permit to erect their theater. The proposed plans call for a building 32 by 66 feet with stucco and corrugated iron siding. The roof will be covered with asbestos or other fire-resisting shingles." Another story tells of a change to the maps around this time back in 1920. Thanks to the initiative of the Palatka Rotary Club, the present name of Palatka's main business thoroughfare, Lemon Street, is to be changed to Putnam Avenue. And a find on the beach that was much more than a seashell. Jesse Edwards, a well-known resident of Anastasia Island, found a peculiar machine floating in the ocean and brought it to his home. It was round and it had a cap in it, leading to the impression at first it might be a floating mine that had traveled the Atlantic from the North Sea, where thousands of them were placed during the World War. Mr. Edwards chopped open the thing with a hatchet, finding the powder very dry and containing a strong odor. Examination by military men from St. Augustine resulted in the discovery that instead of a mine, it was a smoke bomb used during the war for making screens. With this week's Veterans Day holiday, have you ever wondered how they observed this day in the past? Well, in 1920, it was called Armistice Day, and there's an article in this week's newspaper telling us about it. The article reads, "Hastings is celebrating Armistice Day by locking up the town and throwing the key away. Every place of business has been closed tight for the entire day. No local celebration is scheduled, although the great bulk of people in this section have made plans to accompany the local company of the National Guard and local veterans to Palatka for a big time in that city. Owing to the rain, a good many local people changed their plans at the last moment and remained at home. A good representation from Hastings went to Palatka, however, rain or no rain, and report having had one big and most enjoyable time." I hope you enjoyed this week's edition of Hastings Headline History. This podcast was brought to you by Presenting the Past, bringing history back to the present through historic presentations and the sale of treasures from days gone by. This episode was written and produced by me, Michelle Murillo, with the aid of vintage copies of the Hastings Herald. Now it's time for this week's musical memory, when we listen back to a song that everyone was listening to over 100 years ago. This week, a song that will make you do what its title claims. Performed by Bix Beiderbecke and his jazz band, the tune was one that'll have you tapping your feet from the very first note. Not surprising that it came from Beiderbecke, who was considered one of the most influential jazz soloists of his time. Often people expect someone with that kind of title to have been professionally trained and at the top of their class. Not Beiderbecke. Born in 1903, as a teenager, he taught himself to play the cornet by ear, which is why many looked puzzled watching him play, as his fingering technique was not typical. And maybe that, in part, led to his musical style that stood out from the rest. His first paid gig was when he was 17, and music seemed to be the only thing he was actually good at. He was failing in high school, still a junior at age 18 because of failing multiple years. He got expelled from boarding school and had run-ins with the law. He played small gigs here and there until the nearly mid-20s, when his career took off. Unfortunately, it was a short-lived one. While he was doing well in music, he was also doing very, very well in drinking, way too much. His alcoholism was so bad, it started to impact his health. He tried rehab and other treatments, but none worked. He died in 1931 at the age of 28. So let's listen back to a song that was a hit during the high times of his career. Here's Bix Beiderbecke with Fidgety Feet.